Hey everybody. Tonight I'm going to go over a very common questions that we get when people call us about ordering parts, or if they've already ordered parts and they need help figuring stuff out. They don't know what goes with what. So this video is going to be all about Holley EFI harnesses, right? So it may seem kind of self-explanatory to a lot of people that have dealt with this over the years, but it can be a little intimidating, if you will, when you're new to this, right? So the first thing we're going to talk about here is I'm going to use a Dominator for reference because a Dominator ECU has every connector on it that any of the other ECUs could have. Okay, so when we look at a Dominator ECU, here it is on Holley's website. There it is. It has 6 connectors on it. So we're going to go into your software, and I'm in my help folder of the software. If you don't know where that is, you would just go up here and hit help, and then contents. I'm in the wiring manual. So this gives us a view of an HP ECU and a Dominator ECU. So a Terminator X, not an X Max, has got the same connectors here as an HP. Okay, so J1A and J1B. These are your main engine harness connectors. These are the connectors that are going to be used for your oil pressure, your fuel pressure, your map sensor, your first O2 sensor, your injectors, your coils. All that stuff is going to be in J1A and J1B. So for your main engine harness, no matter who you buy it from, right? So there's companies out there that make them aftermarket, and then of course Holley sells them. They have an input-output connector on them. Okay, so when we look at an input-output connector, what we're looking at is these inputs right here. If we look at J1A3, right there, J1A4, those are 2 inputs. J1A12 and A13, those are 2 more inputs. And then we've got outputs as well. So there's J1B3, J1B10, 11, and 12. So those are your 4 outputs. Those are auxiliary inputs and outputs that will run stuff like boost control or dome pressure or your trans brake or a whole bunch of plethora of different things. So this is your basic engine harness, okay? This is for a Terminator X and for an HP. You've got J1A, you've got J1B, and you can add right here, like it says, it's got 4 additional inputs and outputs on there. So let's look at that harness first, right? So I'm going to show you how to find it. So if we go to brands and we go to Holley EFI, and we can go to HP, right? And we can go to HP harnesses. And we need to find our input-output harness, right? So harness type, call it auxiliary, and there it is. Connector J1A, J1B, input-output auxiliary harness. So this is the auxiliary harness that will plug into the connector that's already populated on the main engine harness. It'll give you 4 additional inputs and 4 additional outputs. So that covers your main engine harness and an additional I/O for that engine harness. If we look at the software here, I'm going to come back over here and click back into the software, minimize. If we look at that, we can hit pin map, and that's these right here, right? So this is J1A12, A3, A13, and A4. Those are inputs. Okay. If you don't know the difference between these inputs, I've made other videos on understanding these inputs, but I'm also going to follow up here in the next few days, kind of doing an overview and a step-by-step on all the basics of how to get your stuff set up. I feel like it hasn't been touched on in a little while, so I'm going to redo it. And then if you wanted to look at outputs, you'd click over here and hit View Outputs, and there we go. We've got a few outputs already populated, right? So this is boost positive solenoid, boost negative solenoid, staging output. Those again correspond to that I/O connector, that input-output connector that's on J1 or on your J1A and B, your main engine harness. So right here. So if you have a Dominator ECU or a Terminator X Max, you have more options. Okay. So let's look at Dominator. So if we look up here, this little tree here, you can come back here to HP EFI, and then again it will bring you with just your HP options. Come back a little bit further and hit Dominator. Okay, so now let's look at Dominator harnesses. So this is where people get confused the most. And I'm going to change this right here, harness type, and we're going to go to auxiliary. right? So this is where people get, oh, not auxiliary, I was wrong. This is where people get confused the most, right? And that is the additional input and outputs that you can do with a Dominator, right? So with Dominator ECU gives you an additional 4 connectors that you're not used to seeing if you have an HP, and they're right here. Okay. So these two right here, J1A, J1B, they're already populated with your main engine harness. These 4 here have not been populated yet. So you have 4 separate connectors that do the majority of the same thing. Okay, J2A right here, right next to your engine harness, is all inputs. Okay, so this is also the connector where the second wideband O2 sensor is located. So if you wanted the J2A harness, the auxiliary harness, the part number is right here, 558401. So I'll show you that. We go up here and we just search 558-401, and there it is. So what this is this is your lead for your second O2 sensor. This is one of the most common things that people contact us to try to figure out what they need to add a second O2 sensor. For you Terminator X guys, you can't use this. There's no way to add a second O2 sensor to your Terminator X. But for a Dominator, there is. So this is your J2A harness, okay? So if we look back here in the help section of the software, J2A, second O2 sensor, and it also is inputs. So here it is. This is the pinout for J2A. These are all of your inputs. Notice it says wideband comparison shield, heater, yada yada. There's some wideband O2 sensor stuff in there. J2A is all inputs. Let's look at it in the pin map in the software. And if you don't remember how to get to the pin map, you're back here on your main screen. Just hit pin map, and it'll bring it up. So this right here, J2, and then notice it says A10, A1, A27, A20, A19. That is the location on the connector. And the connector's got the numbers printed in it, right? So that's the location on the connector as to where you're supposed to put this. Input number seems to screw people up. They think that they're in the J2 connector and they should go to pin number 5. No, that is not correct, okay? It's just listed. The pin number is right here on the left-hand side. So if we look, we have a ton of inputs, okay? So if we notice, it's all inputs. There's no outputs. If we click on View Outputs up here, notice it says J2 and it's B, right? Because that's the J2B connector, but the J2A connector is all inputs, right? So J2B is all outputs, right? Same deal, right? We got all inputs on one, we got all outputs on the other. So J2A, if you wanted to know where your 5 volt and your sensor ground comes from, you can always click up here and hit View Fixed. So there's J2A. So A18 and A22 are sensor ground, and A26 is 5 volt. So that's to power and ground your sensors, right? So whether it be pressure transducers or temp sensors, whatever it may be, ride height sensor, whatever it is, that's where you would power and ground them from, as long as they're a 5 volt or ground signal. So that covers J2A. This one is when we sell a Dominator to somebody. This is typically like if it's a twin turbo application or if it's a nitrous application or a blower application, they want this J2A harness. We try to drive them into doing that just so that they can use 2 O2 sensors. So that brings us to J2B, right? So again, remember we were talking about all outputs. So there it is, J2B. This is all outputs. With J2B, you have outputs, and you have you have 2 different types of outputs, right? You've got a 12 volt output or a PWM positive. If you don't know what a PWM positive is, it's a pulsed 12 volt signal. I go over that in a couple other videos, and I'm going to retouch on that again, like I said earlier, on what you can do with PWM. But these are, if it says H, that stands for high side or 12 volt, and P plus means PWM positive. G stands for ground, and then PWM negative, right? So it's pulse width modulated of a ground signal, okay? So you have 2 different two different output types. And let's see, that harness number right here is 558402. So pop back over to the website. Notice it's in chronological order, right? 402. Let's look for that one. So this is an auxiliary harness, It comes with some lead of wire with pins already crimped on it, so that you can populate it yourself and run it to whatever you were trying to trigger. So a lot of people have asked, well, what do I need these harnesses for, right? Well, let's look at the software. We can, there, right there, that first one right here is the shifter, right? So that's the shift output. So we're going to activate the shift solenoid here. This right here is a dump valve. That's the ground. We're sending a ground signal out to a relay to activate a dump valve. This connector here, J2B, is also where you populate your second and third sets of injectors. So if you're into that kind of stuff, I've made some videos on that. But if you're into 2 and 3 sets of injectors, this is where you would populate them into the J2B connector. So, right. Now let's move on to J3. So J3 and J4 are a little different, okay? A Terminator X Max has the same J3 and J4 connector, and a Dominator has the same J3 and J4 connector. So if you notice, J3 has got a bunch of 5-volt right there, that 5, those are 5-volt type inputs. And then it's got multifunction inputs. Those are 5-volt, 20-volt, thermistor, 12-volt, and ground. Okay, so you could send a whole bunch of different stuff to those 2 pins. And notice J3, unlike J2A and J2B, has outputs on it as well. Okay, so these here are outputs and inputs in the same connector. There's something else that J3 does, and that is this right here, DBW, drive-by-wire. So this is why the Terminator X Max has this connector on it, and it's for the drive-by-wire. So let's look at what our auxiliary harness is. So 558403, that is just an auxiliary harness if we weren't going to use drive-by-wire. So if we come over here, search for 403, notice it looks very similar to the other ones, right? It's a connector, a handful of wires pre-terminated to or pre-populated with pins on it for the connector, so you can populate them how you see fit and run them to inputs and or outputs. So that is J3 if you don't have drive-by-wire. If you do have drive-by-wire, there's a bunch of different harness options for you, right? So if we go back over here to harnesses, right, and we change the harness type to drive-by-wire, we've got a bunch of different options, right? So the majority of the drive-by-wire stuff is GM based, right? So let's just look at this first one. So this is a GM drive-by-wire harness. It obviously connects to the pedal and to the throttle body, so it can control based off of the input from the pedal versus the output that it sends to the throttle body, right? Now, this harness, if we come down here and click on wiring diagram, this harness is pre-populated with all the stuff that goes to the pedal and to the throttle body, okay? So in order to make this work, we need to make it work inside the software. So if we come back over here to the software, notice they're all blank, right? There's nothing in them, okay? There's nothing in anything in J3. So I'm going to hit done. If we want to make this work in the software, we'll go toolbox and add individual config. We scroll through our individual configs, and what an individual config is one of these icons up here, okay? And we can go to DBW, and let's just say GMLSX, okay? So notice it brought us a new icon up here, that's drive-by-wire ICF. We're not going to go over how to set up drive-by-wire. I'm going over what harnesses you need to make this work. If you click on pin map, notice a lot of this stuff has been pre-populated for us. So these are basically locked out now. So these are inputs that are locked out that we can't repurpose, and these are outputs that are locked out that we can't repurpose, right? So and again, it will depend on if you use a dual drive-by-wire or not. If you notice, it says here B3 and B23 is throttle body number 2, throttle position sensor number 1 and 2. Throttle body number 2 means there'd be 2 throttle bodies. If we had a dual throttle body setup, we would obviously be using a dual throttle body harness, right? And that would look like this, right? So notice it's got 2 plugs for throttle bodies. So if we were to choose dual throttle body or dual drive-by-wire throttle bodies harness, we would have to change some software settings over here. So we come back into the software, we can go to drive-by-wire, And you could just check right here for dual throttle bodies, and then we go back to this pin map and notice that those are now not have an X through them. They don't have an X through them or a line through them anymore, and neither does the force motors. So that is J3. That is your drive-by-wire and or your just input and output. Now, even if you have dual drive-by-wire throttle bodies, you still have the use of all these outputs and these two inputs, okay? So you still gain two more input, even if you have drive-by-wire, you're still picking up two more inputs and a handful more outputs off of the J3 connector. So hopefully everybody follows that and that makes sense. So if you needed that drive-by-wire harness, let's recap again. What you would do is you're in, we're in fuel injection, we're in harnesses. You just change your harness type to drive-by-wire, and it'll pre-populate all of the available drive-by-wire harnesses for the ECU. So we uncheck it, it brings us back to everything. Now, that brings us to the last connector, which is J4. So I'm kind of a nerd. I've been doing this for a long time. J4 is actually my favorite connector, right? So I know it sounds terrible because I have a favorite connector, but I do. So I'll tell you why. J4, in my opinion, is the best connector. One, the main reason why I like it the most is because it has all of the different types of inputs and outputs on it, right? You've got frequency speed inputs. You've got 5 volt and 20 volt, and every type of input available is on this connector, as well as a plethora of outputs, right? So if we look at the pin map here, we've got, what's this, 4 ground outputs and 6 power outputs, right? So 6 12 volt outputs. So there's 10 outputs on J4. When I wire cars, I typically run into outputs before I run out of inputs. But then we look at the input side, right? Look at this. We got 5 volt frequency and ground inputs here. So these I use a lot. We've got thermistor and 20 volt inputs here. Then we've got a bunch of 5 volt inputs. So J4 is probably if you're going to buy one connector and harness to add a bunch of stuff to, I like J4 the best, right? Because you can populate your shifter into J4, and by doing so, all you do is just click, drag, and drop it. But you can populate, like when I wire up the Davis Technologies VPSs, I use either J3 or J4 depending on the car. But like I can power the whole VPS from the output on J3, and then have a nice lead, the one-piece harness that comes from that connector and goes straight out and has all my inputs and outputs on it. So it makes for a nicer job. But the other thing that's in J4 is transmission control, okay? So let's look, before we go to transmission control, let's look at the J4 harness. What's that part number? Anybody got an idea? I'm not teaching a class, so sorry, I'm talking to myself. It's 558404. So we come up here, we can go 558404, and again, notice they're in chronological order, or numerical order. 558404, here's our J4 harness. It's got everything we need for just basic inputs and outputs. Now, that connector is the same connector you'll use if you use transmission control. If you need transmission control, and what I mean by transmission control is electronic transmission control, not controlling your air shifter, but an electronic transmission control. We click done on here. Let's go to transmission. So right now, if you have a racing transmission, so let's say you have a Turbo 400 or a Power Glide, this doesn't apply to you. If you have a 4L80, if you have a 4L70, a 4L60, a Ford AOD, a 4R70W, a Chrysler, it's not available yet, but if you have one of these transmissions, you need the ECU to control the transmission for you, okay? So let's just pick let's see, a 4L80, right? Because that's about the most common one out there, right? So we picked transmission 4L80. Let's go back to that pin map. And notice how these say reserved now, right? And the reason being is that those have been pre-populated now because we picked a 4L80 transmission, and the computer knows that we need to have certain things going on to J4 connector from the transmission back to the ECU. Same thing's going to happen when we look at view outputs. Notice that there's 4 of the outputs are reserved, right? So what this means is you can't drag and drop. Like if I grab this shift single, I can't drop this on here, but I can put it there, right? So you still have access to using all of these outputs. You still have access to using all of these inputs. But when you use transmission control, it is locked out and you have to use certain pins. And they tell you just buy the harness from Holley, right? So it makes the most sense. You just make it plug and play. So let's find a 4L80 4L80 harness. So we come over here to harness type and we go to transmission. Boom. We've got a few different options here, right? So 4L60, 4L80, grab a hold of that. There's our harness, right? So if you wanted to see a wire, though they don't have a wire diagram on here, but it pre-populates all the stuff when you select the correct transmission that you have, and you still have access to using all of the features of the I/O in the software that you may want to use in addition. So when I say J4 is probably my favorite connector, it's because not only can you use the transmission control with an electronic transmission, but or electronically controlled transmission, but it also still gives you a bunch of outputs that you can do stuff with, right? So if you were sending 12-volt signals out to your relay board to turn on water pump and fans and a trans fan or whatever, you can do it all from right here off of J4. So it makes it very versatile, and still gives you plenty of room for a whole bunch of inputs. So to recap, let's look at some harnesses, right? So we're on Holley's website, and I'll just go back over how I got here, right? We go to brands, scroll down a little bit, Holley EFI, scroll down a little bit, click on Dominator EFI, scroll down a little bit, there it is, Dominator harnesses. So when I always go to Dominator harnesses because it's got all of them, right? So it's got all the stuff for J1A and J1B, plus it's got J2A through J4. So we select harness type and we pick whatever we want. So hopefully that explains J2A through J4. I'm gonna do a lot more of these style of videos where we kind of just educate the end user on how to make the right choices. Picking out the right parts for their application. We spend a lot of time helping people that aren't necessarily our customers, trying to understand what they've already bought, and hopefully get them going down the right road and using the correct product for their application. So I thought it would be a good idea to pump out a few of these videos and let y'all understand the best way to go about kind of trying to figure out what you need for your application. It can be confusing. There is a lot of part numbers. There's a lot of options. But that's one of the good things about Holley EFI. It's not a bad thing. It may be a little bit of a cumbersome thing for y'all to navigate through, but it's a good thing because you have the options. There's other EFI systems out on the market that you don't have those options. So if you're complaining about, man, I can't figure out which transmission harness I want, just know that you actually have the option to buy a transmission harness. So anyway, hopefully you learned something. Let me know what you think, and we'll get back to it. See ya.